one of the last things I speak of in the evening before I turn in. My research focuses on trade agreements, right? Those free trade agreements you probably have heard a lot about. My interest is in the role of production networks, which are multinational firms, sort of organizing their production in sites that are located in different countries, right? Different sovereignties. Right? And to what extent they lobby for regulatory coordination. So adopting same standards, common standards in health and safety so that it can facilitate production. So when they move goods across countries, they can basically produce the same thing, right? And this is very good for production because you have economies of scale. Right? And this generates an incentive to for political lobbying. And more broadly, I'm interested in the shape and the trajectory of ASEAN regional integration of this kind. Especially, I've got a couple of projects dealing with the ASEAN economic community and to what extent countries have adjusted well, right, to this new era in ASEAN regional integration. I also have another line of research on rising powers in the global economy. Right? Being in Asia, I guess it was Thomas Wolfens who once talked about a tectonic shift of power, right? Sort of head in to Asia, towards Asia. And here the role of institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, very, very important in providing alternative governance mechanisms for governing the international economy. And most recently, the US-China trade war that has been bound up, right, with the pandemic, with decoupling and all sorts of wonderful words that we like to see in the media and talk about. So I said I would showcase my students' studies and research areas, and I'm serious about that. So I just highlighting just a few of them. I don't have that many students, but I will highlight the ones that are most relevant really to my research areas. So I have one student who studies Chinese foreign aid and development capacity in Africa, right? Comparing it largely to the activities of what are called OECD DAC donors, Development Assistance Committee donors. So China as an emerging donor. And then you've got the OECD countries as the, standing donors, the traditional, what we call the traditional donors. I have another student, Tia, who studies foreign aid and educational mobility in developing countries. So his interest is in development, right? And he's decided to focus on to what extent foreign aid, right, promotes educational mobility, right, for in individuals in developing countries, again with a focus on Africa. Last but not least, my student Jess, right, who's very much interested in rising powers, and rising powers will pursue a thesis, right, on how rising powers like China, Brazil, Russia, India, right, have behaved when they are both complainants or respondents in World Trade Organization trade disputes. So these are some of the areas that my graduate students are working in. I place a great deal of importance in collaborations with grad students because it's an important part of both, I think more on the on-the-job training. And so we do together, we conduct together, right, every part of the research process from formulating the research question to publication. So to give you a sense of what the projects I'm working on, so one, is called The Language of Institutional Design, Text Similarity and Preferential Trade Agreements. And here, all right, let me show you what the kinds of results we generate. All right. So I want to tell you that this particular graphic took about 4 months to generate. Right? Because we have over 400 different free trade agreement texts that we collected, either Tia collected or a group of research assistants, undergrads collected. They were all turned into text files. They were all processed, removing numbers, punctuation, putting everything to lowercase, and doing all sorts of processing of text data. Next, we spent a couple of months trying to decide whether we should use whole words, whether we should stem them, or they use a new technique called lemmatization, where we reduce words to like a single word, various formation. So agreement, agreements, accord, these become simply agreement. All right, so we have examples of this. Anyway, we looked at this for about a couple of months, and then we used software to estimate the degree to which any two free trade agreements look like each other. It's a different way of saying that governments like to copy and paste their trade agreements. This is not to say that they're being lazy or anything, but there are actually political explanations for why a government would use a particular text of a trade agreement when they're negotiating with other countries. So what the results are showing here not simply, but it's very interesting, is that when you look at the main document of a free trade agreement, there are very high levels of similarity across the text, about 76.9%. This shows that generally the architecture, right, of trade liberalization, it is pretty consistent across most of the trade agreements that we see. Okay. However, on the other side, this, right, is the same thing we've done with the annexes. I don't know if you are if you're familiar with trade agreements or legal documents, the main text comprises one part, right, and then there's an annex, which is oftentimes much larger than the main text because it has all what we call the devil in the details, right? It has all the reservations, all the exceptions that the negotiating parties claim. So in the one of the recent agreements, the one that Trump withdrew the US from, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, I looked at Singapore's annex, which was quite sizable, which concluded reservations or exceptions for several pieces of legislation that were inconsistent with the TPP. Right, so all this gets put into the annex. And here we see that a lot of the variation in trade agreement provisions actually comes in the annex because there's so many different ways in which governments can, right, carve out for themselves, what we call like autonomous space or exceptions in order to retain some autonomy in trade liberalization commitments. So, okay, so that's one of the things we did. The other, right, let me just go back to the main slide here, if I can get that. The other is my project with Jess on vote shares and power in the Asset Infrastructure Investment Bank. One of the nice graphics we put out here, okay? This shows to what extent, right, countries that joined the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank gained in the share of votes, right, vis-a-vis their shares in the World Bank. Right, so not surprisingly, China gains a lot, right? The most, right, goes to something 20-something%. But we can also see all the other countries. Can you see? So quite a few of the emerging markets will be here, all right? Will be here. So this is the extent to which countries gain from joining the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. All right? Okay. I'm happy to answer any more questions during the Q&A. All right. So what is the training, if you will, of the graduate student apprentice involve? I sort of thought about the various the various dimensions of this over the years that I've practiced consistently. We generally usually have an independent study module where I sit down with the student, we have a customized reading list and a project that the student pursues over the course of a term, right? That gets them started on independent research. The other, of course, as an educator, teaching is an integral part of our life. And here, my students receive training, right, as teaching assistants in my international political economy class or in the political inquiry class, because, of course, my students always get mobilized to TA for this because I guess they're the ones who are always trained quite well in quantitative methods. My students are consistent with sort of my research focus. My students also enroll regularly in the NUS Summer Method School, where they do specialized training, right, in different kinds of methods classes. So everything from quantitative text analysis to network analysis to interviews even, and experimental studies. So this is where they receive this kind of special training, and publications during pre-doctoral years. I don't know if you know, but certainly I don't think it has changed since my graduate years, many years ago or decades ago. It's that the most important correlate, right, of postdoctoral success is publication, right, during your graduate student years. Not to scare you all or anything, but yes, this is something that I was taught and something that I sort of also pursue with my own grad students. Okay. Anyway, so I think I'm done about there. I think that is the end of my slide. Again, thank you for coming. I'd like you to know that, there is the graduate student apprentice really has these two important pillars of practical training and academic rigor. I also like to think from a personal level that if I have done my job right, the students I have trained and that I have put out into the job market are, surpass me in so many, in so many different ways as better scholars and better trained scholars. Right. Thank you. So I welcome your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Yeon. I think there's a question from Hak Ping. Hak Ping, would you like to answer this question live? Sorry, ask the question live. I can unmute you.
Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for a very, very enlightening presentation. And I was asking a very simple question, but I unmuted just to have a chance to say thank you. I couldn't catch the spelling of the name where your grad students go to get method training. And perhaps the reason I'm asking for the question is whether we could, before we apply for a PhD program, maybe go to the same place and just try ourselves out there as well.
Very good. Thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. So do you see my slide here? It's the NUS, it's the Summer Method School. NUS, it's the Summer Method School. It is held at NUS in my department every year for 2 weeks. You receive 35 hours of training. And I believe if you're a grad student here, you can even get course credit for this. There are also some scholarships that are put aside only for NUS students. So I encourage you to, and we have students from all over the world. And I am I'm not just a, I'm also a student in this, on a regular basis, because I like to update, right, and keep up with the current trends and what's going on with all sorts of areas of quantitative methods. So
what does IPSA stand for? Sorry.
It's international. It's the International Political Science Association.
Oh, got it. Cool.
Yeah, so it's a collaboration between our two organizations, and it's been going on for about 8 years now, I think. Or so.
Thank you. Well, Yeon, you have a student in the Q&A box who has mentioned that she's already emailed you to ask for permission to be under your supervision. So I think that speaks volumes to how inspiring your talk is.
Right.
So we have a bit of time. So if any of you have any questions, please feel free to just raise your hand, and I'll be more than happy to unmute you so you can ask your questions in person. So I think, so there's a question by Maheshi, which I think is a great question. Actually, I had it written down myself. And so let me unmute Maheshi so that the question can be asked live. Let me just do this. Okay, Maheshi, you're live. You'll have to unmute yourself in order to ask the question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, very well. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Professor, for that very wonderful speech. I mean, I got the extent to which you actually go to, give your graduate students the opportunities once you're done with your PhD. So what I want to ask is, what do you look for, the qualities which you look for when you, take a student as an apprentice?
That is a very good question. That is a very good question. I think one meeting doesn't do it. So my department is political science. One of the privileges that I have, and it's not because I'm head, I've been teaching this for as long as I've been at NUS, which is now the 10th year. I teach a module called Research Design and Political Science, which is a core module, essential module in graduate studies. And I like to scare them. Every grad student must take this course and deal with me, right? Before they can move forward, so to speak. Right. So here I learn a lot about the student, about how he or she works, their work ethic. So I think much of this is also like a blind date, right? It has to work. It's a two-way street. It has to work. All right. So what I look for, some of the things I look for is I'm a very great believer in discipline. So,
okay.
So discipline is so day in, day out. Right. For me, consistency is a something I admire, something I try to practice, because I think academic life is not a sprint; it's a marathon, and the dedication.
It's like an ongoing thing, yeah.
Yeah. So the dedication, it requires just day after day, failure after failure, getting up and going. Right. And so I look for this quality, and it is evident even with within a few months. right, of sort of interacting with a student. The other that I consider very important, this one you can bring without my spending much time with you, is your writing. So we have to publish, we have to write, right? And so I pay very close attention to how students write their proposals when the application does come in and when I'm approached. Whether it's something as simple as, I think one of my colleagues, Ivan Punk, calls it like, I think it's like academic hygiene or something, like, have you checked for grammar mistakes? Right?
Just thorough you are, is it?
Right. So, and whether you can, so I don't place so much importance on whether, like, are you a social science, do you think social science? I don't necessarily assume that. I think I can train that, but I cannot really sit down and train in writing skills. So, writing skills I consider to be very, very important. So I would say those two. I noticed when I write recommendation letters for students, this kind of discipline is something that I go out of my way to emphasize if I observe it when I observe it in a student and want to praise.
Okay, can I quickly toss in a quick question? I hope it's okay.
Of course.
So when you look for a research brief, usually what's the length you're looking at? Is it 3 to 5 pages?
I don't think there also, I think there are prescribed lengths maybe in the application. I can't remember. So yeah, they're generally not that. I guess 5 pages, maybe 3 to 5 pages. I'm trying to remember, but
that's great. So I think I'm done with the questions, but the way you handled the whole session, I got interested in political science. So let's see.
You might want to talk to some of my grad students first. Okay.
Yeah, sure. Let me see. I'll come up with a research proposal and apply.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay. Great. Thank you. If there are there any other questions? If there's not, then I thought I might slip one in at the same time, just to build a little bit on this idea of, what you mentioned about how the relationship is very much a two-way street. So I think you touched quite a bit on, like, what you look for in a student. And I'm curious, like, so when a student is kind of looking for a good advisor, maybe if you think back about sort of like, where you were in graduate school, like what would be your best tips about trying to identify, a good advisor, which, I think, as we both know, it's kind of a very critical part of your PhD journey.
Right. I think when you're in the application process, of course, the most important thing is the professor's work, published work. I think one thing is like, do you wish you would, do you wish you had written it? I mean, in the same way that I, look at my colleagues' work and, think, do I wish I had written that? So I think that's certainly the first question to ask: how interested you are, in that professor's work. The second is something that you cannot really, at NUS, of course, you're not committed to an advisor from the get-go, right? You have some time. So one of the things I do in my research design module is once they turn in one or two, the first or second, it's the research question or literature review assignment. What I encourage them to do then is, they must go out and talk to a professor in the department, identify someone who might be, in this sort of relevant to this research area, and approach them and speak with them. And there's an interesting variation in the availability of my colleagues too, right? Their willingness to talk. And so all this matters. That's why it's a two-way street.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think that's a really important point, which is, I think at NUS, in some way, although in the application process, you kind of, at the back of your mind may identify someone that you may want to work with, I think one thing that we definitely do stress is that, very often the first year or two are actually based on coursework where you get to interact with a lot more, than just one person. And so I think, as colleagues, we are all kind of sort of very supportive with students really, looking around and sort of trying to figure out what's a good fit, right? So for example, someone who may be a very good fit for one person may have a very different working style from another. And sometimes it's a little bit like dating, right? In a sense, like you don't quite know if the match is going to work out until you sort of have repeated interactions. So thank you very much. If there are no other questions, then I think this is a good time for us to transition to the next speaker. And I want to say a huge thank you to Professor Kim for a wonderful talk and joining us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so up next we have I think Professor Patrick Allen is here.
Hello, good evening. Yes, I'm here.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Good. I think your video is not on. Would you like to turn it on?
Yep.
Yep.
There you go.
Excellent. Thank you. Hi.